Hi, I'm Greg Pollock, the VP of CyberResearch at UpGuard. Today I'm going to be talking about the findings from our most recent research report, in which we looked at how much reconnaissance information an attacker can gather using public business documents. The research team's work typically involves discovering new vectors for data leaks and measuring the prevalence of sensitive data exposed. New technologies emerge, their design decisions and users' misunderstandings lead to exposures of data, and then we try to secure it. However, the technical environment is not all that changes over time. The threat environment and the regulatory environments also change, making practices that at one time constituted a little risk much more dangerous. For example, when I was a kid, I could use a phone book to look up the address and phone number of anyone in my town. Now, that kind of information is considered moderately private, in part because of technical changes like the migration from landlines to cell phones, and in part because digitizing personal information made it more prone to abuse, and thus need to be regulated differently than before. The same pattern holds true for purely digital information stores. For this report, we investigated a kind of metadata that virtually all businesses produce, which is so taken for granted as to be largely unmonitored: the metadata in publicly available PDFs and Microsoft Office documents. Like other digital artifacts, documents can contain metadata that is not obvious to the user, and that metadata can unintentionally leak valuable information about that person, their organization, the structure of the company, its software, and its vendors. Virtually everyone in a company needs to operate on spreadsheets, presentations, and Word documents. I made several in the process of this research project and presentation. And doing so creates a large potential surface area for residual user data to be left like fingerprints on those documents. The MITRE ATT&CK framework gives us a standard for what kinds of tactics will be used by an attacker during each phase of a breach. And it begins with reconnaissance, during which adversaries use any and all sources to gather information they can use to plan future operations, specifically including information about the target's IT systems, their personnel, and their organizations. That information is abundantly available in the metadata of PDF and Office documents available on companies' websites. To find public documents, we went looking the same way that we would find any other public information. We used a search engine. So, using Google, we searched the primary website of each of the global Fortune 500 for PDFs, Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, and PowerPoint presentations. So how big is the public document service area? The first thing we were able to start quantifying is the size of the document service area for a given company, just as we might measure the number of IP addresses or host names using other reconnaissance techniques. Like those measures of a business's digital footprint, the number of documents hosted per domain can vary by orders of magnitude. Searching each of the Fortune 500's primary domains for common document types shows two things of note. First, the total surface area tends to be large and can be enormous. Across the Fortune 500, the average number of PDFs per site was over 9,000. Over 5 million documents are indexed for the Fortune 500 as a whole. This gives us plenty of metadata to begin mapping these businesses. The second point that's interesting about the surface area is how predominant PDFs are. Microsoft Office document types, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, can all be found, but in far smaller numbers. That distribution between PDFs and Office docs makes sense, given that documents published on websites are generally intended to be read but not edited. PDFs are read-only or allow for structured form inputs, and Office documents are intended to be editable. So these two use cases for different document types gives us two ways to use them for reconnaissance. First, we know we can generally collect massive numbers of PDFs for analysis. And second, while we won't find many Office documents, their presence is in itself anomalous, making each one more useful for identifying groups that are potentially acting out of band. So now let's get into some of the metadata found in those thousands of documents, starting with information about the identity and organization of the victim. PDF and Office documents have a few different metadata fields where users and software can describe who's making the document. There are, however, no technical limitations about what you can put in those fields. So what we find in practice are both empty values, which is the recommendation for security, and then all other kinds of information kind of jumbled together. You'll find personal names, usernames, software names, all commingled across the different fields. So let's start with the author field. The best practice is to omit this information. Don't give away anything that you don't have to, like Troy Hunt writes in his article about server headers. In the documents we sampled, the best practice is followed about half the time. 49% of PDF documents had no value for the optional author field. For Office documents, on the other hand, the equivalent field had information between 97 and 99% of the time, so it was almost always some author provided. Again, the different use cases for how these document types are used speak to how they are treated differently. PDFs are typically published for read-only and more likely to be subject to a process for sanitizing them for public consumption, whereas the smaller number of Office docs being published means there may not be as much attention to them or really any process at all for sanitizing them for the public. Like with server headers, documents with exposed author values do not necessarily give away useful information. Similarly, in reviewing the document data, a common practice is to set the author to be the name of the company, which provides a tiny bit of information about what documents from that company look like, but no surprises and not much of a foothold for an attacker. So what information can be found in those varying author fields? Of the PDF sample that had some value for author, 36% had a person's name as the author. The next most common data type was a username, like you'd use for a computer, occurring in 30% of the PDFs with an author. Only then do we get to business names, which were 22% of the author values. Other data types are also found in those author fields. Hundreds of email addresses, URLs for online PDF converters, phone numbers, street addresses, and sometimes full file paths. For Office documents, the overall trends were similar. About half of all Word and Excel documents had a person's name as the author, and around 15% had a username. Only 4% used the business name we would maybe expect to see. In addition to the author fields that could be easily categorized, there were many with data that was highly specific but not matching any patterns. So on manual inspection, which our analysts always do, we saw things like the names of the companies that do not match the document owners, indicating likely vendors producing those documents, also useful. In some cases, the author field even explicitly said that the author is a contractor to the principal company. And when we plotted the number of unsanitized author fields generated per year, we found that the problem is only getting worse over time. So now that an attacker knows who works on which documents, their work username, their email address, business unit, what the standard procedures are, if any, for naming documents, and who follows them and who doesn't, they may want to attempt some kind of technical attack. For this, there are multiple pieces of information that can be harvested from document metadata about the hardware and software used by those employees. First, the author field, like we've been talking about, may contain software version information. So among the files we sampled, only 23 files listed in identifiable software as the author. More concerning, what I alluded to earlier, is that there were over 100 documents with an online software provider, like a PDF converter, as the author. There are many of these sites, you may have used them yourself, some of which convert the document as a one-time transaction where you send your document to them, they send you back a PDF, and some of which continue to host those publicly. For an attacker, identifying that employees of your target use such a site is useful for either tricking them into using your own malicious document converter or targeting those converter sites themselves. To really learn about what software is used at a company, though, we want to look at the fields that are designed to hold that information. Like the author, this field is optional. About 75% of PDF sampled had a value in the creator field. For Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, between 98 and 100% of those sampled had information in the comparable app or app version fields. As one might expect, most of the programs we found were the native producers for PDFs and Office documents, Adobe and Microsoft products respectively. Within those product lines, however, there are many versions, and those many variations were represented in the documents we sampled. Out of 58,000 PDFs with a software version, there were 2,700 unique values. The software can also reveal the OS version. In some cases, this is just whether the plugin is for Windows or Mac, but often the Mac OS version is included as well, providing useful information about potential vulnerabilities. The document sampled contained 857 unique values matching operating system names. 371 files also included matching hardware products, which seem to be printers used for scanning them. So to sum it up, we went looking for reconnaissance data on personal identities, organizations, and technical specs. We found that Fortune 500 companies generally had thousands of public documents, and most of those offered some kind of information in their metadata, from usernames to contractors to third-party software converters. While document metadata is by no means a new problem, some of the documents we analyzed had been produced in the 1990s according to their metadata, it is one that is getting worse. It may be worth revisiting as it provides substantial resources for the beginning stages of reconnaissance. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something today.